Good morning, Slow and Steady Club. I hope you are doing well. I totally forgot to tell you guys that I didn't even send out the email this week, so this is probably a surprise live for most of you. So I might just be talking to myself today, but that's okay because you guys can always watch the replay, and I think that's what most of you are doing anyways. So we're talking about sugar and the brain today. And this is going to be a really important topic, chat, something to watch for the women in the group that have a tendency to self-sabotage with sweet treats, because what I'm going to share with you today is helping you understand why you self-sabotage. And I know that a lot of you think that you lack willpower, you lack you lack motivation, you lack, drive, or, something's wrong with you. And I think that today's chat is going to be very illuminating and very empowering to help you understand that ultimately you are only human, and that sugar was basically designed to make you seek out more of it. And so you can stop blaming yourself and stop shaming yourself and guilting yourself and thinking that you are not worthy, or that something's wrong with you, or that you're just not tough enough, or you don't have enough grit, or whatever it may be. Because as I've been doing this research, I have been paying attention to my own sort of habits and behaviors around sugar. And I'm here to tell you that it's been very eye-opening. I've been doing this research for 2 or 3 weeks now of really understanding how sugar impacts our brain. It's going to really help you. Now, today, what we're going to focus on is how it impacts the brain and how it drives us to make poor decisions. Next week, we're going to talk about what we can do to mitigate that, right? So how we can take control of our brain and how we can control the sugar demon and be able to make better choices. But today, again, we're going to understand why this happens. And so although we're talking about sugar and science, this is a mindset. This is a mindset one, because I know that for a lot of you, you don't understand why you keep self-sabotaging. So save this one. And anytime you feel like you're self-sabotaging, I want you to come back to this video and watch it so that you better understand your behaviors and why you make the choices that you do. Okay, so let me just grab my my cheat sheet for today. And there it is. So let's dive in. Okie dokie. All right, so hopefully you can see this now. So I've called this cheat sheet Sugar in the Brain. Why do we like it so much, and why can't we control ourselves? So before I dive into sort of what happens in the brain that drives us to seek out sugar, I want you all to understand that sugar, when we eat any kind of starch, really, or any kind of sugar or starch, not just sugar, but sugar, flour, chips, even broccoli, any kind of carbohydrate, when it gets digested and metabolized by the body, it gets turned into glucose. Okay, so food can get turned into 3 different things: glucose, amino acids from protein, and triglycerides from fat. So glucose from carbs, triglycerides from fat, amino acids from protein. And ultimately, the body can utilize these sort of like, oh my gosh, I can't even think of the word right now, but these endpoints. There's an actual specific word for it, but my brain is not there right now. But can take these and turn them into energy, right? And this is how we run our metabolism. What you need to understand is that different areas of your body can have a preference for different types of fuel. Your brain loves glucose, okay? Loves glucose. It is the preferred source of energy. And if you've done any research into keto and you've read that the body runs better on ketones, blah, 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 in certain sort of conditions, potentially. But ultimately, your body or your brain specifically really loves glucose. And that's really important for you to understand, because that's going to help you understand sort of like why we are so prone to seeking out sugar. Because again, think of everything in your body, all of your desires, your cravings, your hunger, your appetite, all of the hormonal changes that you experience when you're like, why is this happening? It is always, always, always a very primal adaptation by the body to help you survive. And so your brain, you need your brain to survive, because you need your brain to think about what you're going to do to survive. So your brain always wants to be high performing, which helps to understand why you might be seeking out sugar. Okay. So you need to understand that. The other thing that I want you to understand is that calories in, calories out matter for weight loss. Always. It doesn't matter what diet you're on, the calories in, calories out matters. But this is where I think this will help you sort of understand why your macros are important and the quality of your calories matter, because they impact how the metabolism work, how your hormones work. And in this instance, again, we're going to be looking at the impact of sugar on your brain and how it drives us to seek out more sugar, which ultimately makes it harder to stay in a deficit. Because if you're not losing weight, you're not in a deficit. And it could be because you are overeating on average because of potentially too much sugar, okay? So I just want you to kind of understand that, just to set the sort of framework or the scene of what I want you to be thinking about as we move through this. So there are 3 different mechanisms that drive cravings, 2 major ones and 1 kind of minor one. So again, glucose is the brain's preferred source of energy. And you have what you can call dedicated neural machinery, so neurotransmitters in your brain that are completely devoted to seeking out sugar and feeding your brain. Okay, now think about that. This has nothing to do with your willpower or your motivation or your drive. This is beyond your control. This is wired into your brain that it is trying to seek out sugar. And I want you to remember that next time you notice the negative self-talk coming up because you caved and you ate the chocolate bar. Okay, so we're going to talk about the top 2 in depth. So number 1 is taste. Okay, so one part of your brain is dedicated, once again, to driving you to seek out things that taste sweet. Okay, and this is hardwired in every mammal, animals, humans, fruit flies. Okay, there is a part of the brain that is dedicated to driving you to seek out things that taste sweet. And then there's a parallel pathway that is driving you to seek out things that elevate your blood glucose. Again, defense mechanism, right? Survival mechanism, right? It just so happens that foods that taste sweet usually elevate our blood glucose. But they're 2 different pathways. And the elevate blood glucose could also be like a salty very starchy food, just to kind of separate those two, but they are different. So when you are craving chocolate, you are craving both the taste of the chocolate, the sweetness, and you are craving what is like the nutritive component of eating the sweet food, which is that rise in blood sugar to feed your brain. Okay. Now, this is going to be especially true in women that are metabolically inflexible. And I won't dive into that too much here, but part of what we're doing inside this program is we're teaching your body to be metabolically flexible. We're teaching your body how to use fat and carbohydrates as a source of energy, both efficiently. Ketones, going back to that, so when your body uses fat for energy, it's actually taking fat and through the Krebs cycle, a very complicated process, it's turning fat into ketones. And you don't have to be in full ketosis to have ketones. You're always producing ketones, by the way. But those ketones can also get to your brain. So the more flexible you have, the more metabolically flexible you have, the more capacity you have to feed your brain with an alternate fuel source, and therefore maybe potentially not seeking out sugar as much because your brain isn't feeling stressed out. So this is really important because you may have noticed when you started this program that as you started shifting to a lower carb approach with an emphasis on eating more fat, some of your cravings went away, or maybe they went away completely at the beginning because you weren't even ever having sugar, right? And so that is part of, again, you feeding your brain with an alternative source, okay? So let's talk about this first pathway. So this is how sweet tasting food, ice cream, chocolate, donuts, anything that you can think of, how it literally changes our perception of the world. Okay, I'm telling you guys, this is going to blow your mind. So when we eat something that tastes sweet, there are receptors in our mouth that very quickly send a signal to the brain that make you pay attention to the source and the abundance of that sweet tasting food. Okay, so it literally changes your perception and you become hyper focused on whatever tastes sweet. So it becomes more appetizing. Sugar, anything sweet, becomes more appetizing, but food in general becomes more appetizing. So literally how you perceive the world changes the moment you have sugar in your mouth. Okay, it's mind-blowing. But I want you to understand, when you eat sugar, your perception of food immediately changes, and you will be seeking out more sugar, and you will be seeking out more food in general. Okay, now how does this work? So this is where we're going to talk about dopamine. Okay, so dopamine is the hormone that is often it's like our pleasure hormone, right? So it's a hormone that is released by the brain, and it's a hormone that drives motivation, right? Which is good. So we want some dopamine, because if you are dopamine deficient, then you have no drive, no motivation, and you just want to lie around on the couch and do nothing. Dopamine also drives cravings and gets us in the pursuit of something. So this can be good in the right context, but it can also be bad. So dopamine affects how we feel pleasure, and it drives motivation. Okay. Now, in the context of sugar, when we eat sugar, here's what you need to know about dopamine. And this is really, really, really important. Dopamine does not create the sensation of satiety. Okay, so we've talked about hunger hormones. We've talked or hormones that affect hunger, hormones that affect satiety, or that feeling of satisfaction. Leptin is a satiety hormone. Dopamine is a hunger hormone. It does not create satiety. It produces the feeling of wanting more. So understand that when you eat sugar, your mouth, the taste of sweetness, sends a signal to your brain. Your brain releases dopamine, and instead of feeling satisfied, you feel the sensation of wanting more. Okay. And it is sweet taste specifically that is going to release the trigger of dopamine. And this is especially true of sweet liquids. Okay. So sodas, juice, even diet sodas. Okay. So this is important to understand. Liquid, specifically sweet liquids, are going to activate the release of dopamine. Now, here's what you have to understand about dopamine, which is so important in understanding why you cannot control yourself around sugar. So the dopamine pathway operates on this pleasure-pain balance. And this is talked a lot about in literature about addiction. And basically what happens is that anytime we engage in a behavior that stimulates dopamine, which could be eating sugar, it could be crack cocaine, alcohol, scrolling, Facebook, all of these things that stimulate dopamine. As soon as we stimulate dopamine, there is a subsequent increase in another hormone that makes us feel frustration, pain, lack, void, because it's trying to balance things out. So dopamine makes you feel good. And then immediately after, your brain releases a hormone that makes you feel like shit. Okay? That's basically what it means. And so when you think about it that way, it just really puts it into perspective of what happens when you eat sugar. And you could even do this as an experiment. Eat a piece of chocolate, right? Like go to the grocery store and get a I don't know, like a caramel or something, right? Eat a piece of chocolate and notice how you experience it. So when you're eating the chocolate, you're like, when you're first eating it, it's like you're going to feel like this pleasure and it's going to be amazing. And you're going to feel like you're really satisfying that desire. But when you finish eating that chocolate, what you're going to notice is that your brain and your body shift towards wanting more. And this is that action between pleasure and pain that's going on in your brain. Okay. Now here's the kicker. And you've probably heard this before in the context of other addictions or addictive substances. If you have another piece of chocolate, your dopamine levels will never go back up to the same extent as the first piece. And this is why the heroin addict, for example, never feels the same high as the first hit, because they're also, you've maybe heard this, they're always chasing that first hit. Well, when you have a first piece of chocolate, you get this initial first like dopamine hit, the pleasure, right? The second piece of chocolate will not give you that same high, nor will the third or the fourth. And maybe you've experienced this before. And if you haven't, I want you to pay attention. Next time you have dessert, right? And you get that plate of dessert, the first bite is the best bite of the entire plate because the dopamine hit is the largest. The second, third, fourth bite, they're not the same. And by the time you're finishing your last one, you're not getting the same dopamine hit, okay? That you're seeking it out, but you're not getting it. So that's a really important piece to keep in mind. Another important piece to keep in mind is this. The longer it's been since you've indulged in something that gives you a dopamine hit, the bigger the hit is going to be, but the greater the down, because again, it's this pain pleasure sort of balance that's going on, right? So this makes it a very complicated balancing act, because if you deprive yourself of sugar for too long, when you eat it, you're going to get a much bigger dopamine hit than you've experienced in a long time. And you're going to subsequently have a much bigger down, which is going to make you want to binge on the sugar, right? So you can see how this is kind of a complicated act, because you also don't want to necessarily be eating sugar every day because it's so addictive. And so this is why sugar is so problematic. And I think what we need to understand as women as we're trying to control our food choices is that whereas other substances that impact dopamine, such as, like cocaine, heroin, alcohol, these things, if you are a person that's trying to manage your intake of these things, you would be a person in recovery, like a drug addict in recovery, an alcoholic in recovery, and you would never touch those things again, ideally. But with a sugar addict, if you are addicted to sugar, it's very hard. It's very, very hard because sugar is normalized, and it's not considered to be like a substance abuse, right? Even though it has these terrible consequences on our health. So what does this mean for you? Now, again, next week, we're going to be diving into, whoops, what happened there? Next week, we're going to dive into what we can do in order to take some control over the mechanisms that drive us to seek out sugar. But I want you right now to just think about being aware of how sugar is going to influence your brain and your desire to eat more sugar, right? So next time you have that piece of chocolate or that donut or that mocha cappuccino latte from Starbucks, right? I want you to think about the immediate impact on your brain, okay? I'm going to take a sip of coffee. All right. I want you to be aware that every time you eat sugar, you're going to experience pain and you're going to want more of it. I want you to remember that the longer you deprive yourself of sugar, the bigger the hit is going to be, which means it's going to be that much harder to control your behavior around sugar because the hit's going to be bigger. The bigger the hit, the bigger the down, right? And this is a bit of a tease as to what we're going to talk about as we're going to be jumping into sort of like the tools. But I want you to think about what are some healthier ways to raise dopamine to just maybe some healthier levels, right? So think again of the Goldilocks principle as it applies to everything in this program. Not too much, not too little, but just right. And the same is true of dopamine. So we want to raise dopamine, but not to unhealthy levels that we get this subsequent downer that drives us to seek out more. Okay. So that's a little bit of a tease of where we're going to be going next week, but keep that at the back of your mind. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the second pathway. So the first pathway, once again, is just about how the moment sugar goes in your mouth, there's little sensors in your mouth that send a signal to your brain to release dopamine. And that dopamine tells another part of your brain to release downers to get you to seek out more, right? All going back to the fact that your brain literally loves glucose and is trying to use dopamine and the subsequent downer to get you to eat more, okay? All subconsciously, nothing that you have anything to do with. So now we're going to talk about the second pathway, okay? Now, when you eat sugar, there are things that happen in your stomach that once again are beyond your conscious control that are making you to seek out foods that raise blood glucose. Now, again, these are two separate pathways that are parallel to each other. So part of your brain is getting you to seek out sweet taste. Another part of your body, this happens in your gut, is getting you to seek out foods that raise glucose. They happen, sweet and glucose happen to usually be the same. Now, this is really, again, this is very, very interesting. But again, a food does not have to be sweet in order for this second pathway to operate. And so they've done these experiments on people. So what they did is they gave people 2 bottles of water. And what the scientists did in this experiment is they eliminated the sweet taste, but it still had glucose. So it still raised blood sugar, but there was no sweet taste. Okay. So people were put in this room where they had 2 bottles of water. In one, there was glucose that would raise their blood sugar levels, but they couldn't perceive it. They couldn't taste it. Now, what they found out is that they chose the drink that raised their blood, or the water that raised their blood sugar levels, even though there was no sweet taste, because their body was driving them to drink that. So this is that second pathway. It is absolutely unbelievable. So unlike the dopamine hit that you get from tasting the sweet taste, this pathway is triggered 15 minutes later once it hits your digestive system. So you get 2 hits. The instant hit when you eat the chocolate, and then 15 minutes later, even if you've put that chocolate down, you've had the willpower to put it down, 15 minutes later, you get a second dopamine release that's driving you to eat more of whatever you just did. Okay. How this happens is that we have neurons in our gut, and they send a signal via something called the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is sort of like the main communication between the gut and the brain. Now, you may not have heard this before, but your gut is considered to be your second brain. It has a mind of its own. Okay, so you've got a brain in your gut, and you've got a brain in your brain. They communicate with each other constantly via the vagus nerve. And the brain in your gut senses the sugar or the rise in blood glucose and sends another signal to your brain, which further stimulates the dopamine pathway and therefore the pleasure pain pathway. Okay, here's something that's quite shocking. When you eat salty treats, right? Next time you go and buy a bag of chips, read the ingredients, and I can almost guarantee that they will have sugar, even if it's a salty treat. And this is because manufacturers know how addictive sugar is. And so they intentionally put sugar in the foods to trigger this dopamine pathway, because the salty pathway works very differently. We could talk about that another time. But they will literally put sweet, like sugar, in salty foods to stimulate this dopamine pathway. Okay. So again, what does this mean to you? I want you to start paying attention to how you feel 15 minutes after you eat something that raises blood glucose levels. Okay. And I want you to pay attention to if you start to notice cravings in that 15-minute period, if you're seeking out more of it. Okay. What I didn't write here, or maybe I did later on, I can't remember. One thing to pay attention here is that, we're going to talk about this in the tools. More on this next week, but very quickly. The sharper the rise in blood glucose and the higher the rise in blood glucose, the bigger the dopamine hit, the bigger the downer, right? Going back to just like that pain pleasure. So think of that when you are deciding if you're going to incorporate a sweet treat, and we're going to talk about this in the tools, but if a food raises your blood sugar levels faster and higher, you're going to get more dopamine and therefore more of a downer, and you're going to seek it out more. So you can think about that as, for instance, if you have, let's say, a sweet potato that's sweet versus gummy bears. So the sweet potato, yes, it's sweet. Yes, it raises blood glucose. Yes, it might give you a little bit of a dopamine hit. Let's call that like cocaine. Whereas the gummy bears would be like the equivalent of crack cocaine, in the sense that it's going to give you your dopamine hit faster and it's going to be bigger. So just, again, things to think about as you're starting to evaluate your relationship with sugar. Now, the third pathway, again, I'm not going to talk too much about this one because I kind of referred to it at the beginning anyways, but it refers to just how sugar is metabolized in the brain. And basically, just understand it is the quickest source of food for the brain. It is the preferred source of food for the brain. unless ketones are available, hence why metabolic flexibility is a key and why we want the body to be at least sometimes producing ketones, right? And that because of this, because the brain just literally likes sugar, it's going to drive you to seek out more, okay? Unless it's got an alternate fuel source. So super, super important here. Okay, there's one more thing that I'm going to talk about today, and then I'm gonna shut us down for the day because I know I'm giving you a lot of information, and I want to talk about fructose. So there's different types of sugar. Fructose is one of them. Fructose eventually in the body gets turned into glucose. Once again, everything gets turned into glucose. I'm going to have another sip of coffee because if not, my throat gets dry. Now, fructose, you may have heard of it. Fructose is found in fruit, right? That's why in the Happy Hormones Reset, we eliminate fruit. We're eliminating fructose. You probably remember reading about that. But more importantly, high fructose corn syrup and most processed foods, because most processed foods incorporate high fructose corn syrup, okay? And maybe you've heard of this before, but high fructose corn syrup is like, if there were like 5 foods and I'm like, whatever you do, do not eat this, I would incorporate high fructose corn syrup. Okay, so fruit, yes, it contains fructose. About 10% of the sugar in fruit is fructose. So it's not as problematic when you are consuming it in moderation. Although, again, I would not recommend having like sugar and like 4 servings of fruit a day. I think that's a mistake. But fructose or high fructose corn syrup has 50% of the sugars in high fructose corn syrup, or half of them are fructose. And this is problematic. And this is why. And this is really, really important to understand. Fructose impacts the neural circuits that regulate hunger. Remember, the foods that you eat have a direct impact on your hormones. They can make them work for you, or they can make them work against you. This is a case where they make them work against you. So what fructose does is it has the ability to lower hormones and peptides that suppress hunger, including ghrelin. Okay, so when you eat fructose, the hormones that suppress ghrelin go down, which means when you eat fructose, ghrelin goes up and your hunger goes up. Okay, so fructose literally impacts your hormones and consequently your brain, because what happens is you eat fructose, the hormones that suppress ghrelin go away. So ghrelin, the hormone ghrelin, goes up. And what ghrelin does is it sends a signal to your brain to seek out food. This is regardless of how many calories you've eaten, doesn't matter. Maybe you just had like a Big Mac or whatever. It's gonna make you seek out food. And all of this is gonna make it, once again, harder to control caloric intake, okay? So super important to understand. So what this means for you, once again, is that if you are trying to just control your hunger in general, your sugar intake in general, eating fructose, specifically fructose, is not a good idea. Right? Specifically high fructose corn syrup, but potentially even fruit. So pay attention next time you snack on fruit, and pay attention to if it stimulates your appetite. Because if it's stimulating your appetite, you may be very sensitive to fructose, and it might be suppressing the hormones that help you control ghrelin. And if you are going to choose something that's sweet, you definitely want to avoid high fructose corn syrup, because this is literally going to impact your hormones and literally going to make it harder for you to stay in control of your choices. Okay. So again, today we've really examined how sugar impacts the brain specifically, but also some of the other pathways that help us control our food choices. And hopefully it helps you to understand why maybe sometimes you make poor choices, and that it's not because you lack discipline or self-control or willpower, but it's because subconsciously your brain is literally driving you to seek out these foods and doing all kinds of things, all kinds of hormonal shifts in your body to make it really, 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 really hard to resist. Okay. So what we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about how we can start to control these pathways. Now, obviously, we cannot control them completely because they are primal pathways, but there are some hacks that we can do. So I know there's a couple of you watching. Hi, Angela. Hi, Lisa. And I think both of you joined sort of halfway through, so you might want to go back and review. But before I tune out, do you two ladies have any questions? Let me know. I'll wait for a second and see if anything pops up. Hi, Lisa. Oh, it's Lisa that here. Lisa, okay. I thought I saw Lisa Smith, but I've got two Lisas. So cool. Any questions about that? If you have any, feel free to shoot them my way and I can answer them next week. So again, next week, so interesting, a lot to take in, so I will review. Yeah, I know, so interesting. So very quickly, again, going back to sort of like I said at the beginning, how I've been noticing even with my own behaviors. And I was telling this to someone yesterday, how for what was the occasion? For Valentine's Day, I bought a dairy milk, like a milk chocolate dairy milk, like a big bar of it. And I broke it down into all these like little squares, and I was going to melt it. And I had like strawberries and bananas, and I was going to do like a chocolate fondue. And I had like, you know, a couple of people coming over with kids. So I was going to just like drizzle the chocolate over the fruit. Anyways, my friend, long story short, showed up with chocolate cupcakes. So we never ate the chocolate fondue. So I had this bowl of dairy milk chocolate of like squares already broken up in a bowl. And I ate it all. I couldn't resist. It took about a week. But it was in a bowl. I even had it like stashed in the back of my pantry, and I would be working and I'd be like, ooh, dairy milk. And I would like go to the pantry and have one square, and I'd come sit back down and I'd be like, oh, dairy milk. And I'd go back and I'd have another square. And it is literally this pain pleasure, like dopamine hit down, dopamine hit, void, dopamine hit, drive. Like it was incredible. I hadn't done this research when this happened, but now that I've done the research, I can understand how it was really hard for me to sit here in my office knowing that there was a dopamine hit waiting for me in the kitchen. Anyways, that's it for today, ladies. I hope you enjoyed that. Have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you next week. Bye.